Greetings to all my viewers at the new episode of Conversations for Hungary. And today I would like to continue to discuss Mr. Orban's visit to the White House, meeting President Trump on the 13th, last Monday in the White House, and then the meeting itself and also the media coverage both in Hungary and in the United States. Please join me to discuss Mr. Orban's visit to Washington. Mr. Orban released a video on Facebook in which basically the first sentence is, "That happened also." He said, which means that finally, after the many NATO prime ministers and presidents who already visited the White House, Mr. Orban also was able to sit down with President Trump in the White House. His first sentence in this video basically shows that Mr. Orban is not a very cultured and not a very intelligent person, because he indicated that it was not about the relationship between the United States and Hungary. It was simply about Viktor Orban and his quest to be able to say that he also was received in the White House, sat down with the president, albeit only for 15 minutes and then a little bit more, and nothing substantial was discussed. There was no agenda. There was nothing about the Hungarian-American relations. It was just simply a get-together and get-to-know session. President Trump was not properly briefed about Mr. Orban. He was not ready to talk substance with the Hungarian Prime Minister. It was just simply inviting him to take his measure. That was all that meeting was about. Of course, the Hungarian media, Mr. Orban himself, his foreign minister, and other members of the cabinet indicated or suggested that was a meeting in which President Trump embraced Mr. Orban. The Hungarian media even said that the president called him his twin, political twin in Europe, because of his position, Mr. Orban's position on the migrants that flooded in 2015 and 16 the European continent, that the president called him a soulmate of his, and so on and so forth. The main thing is that the Hungarian media, which is fully controlled by Mr. Orban and his party, wanted to make sure that the impression in Hungary is that Mr. Orban is now the favorite prime minister, the favorite politician of the European Union with Mr. Trump, and nobody else. Nobody else is as close politically, ideologically, and culturally to President Trump than Mr. Orban, which is obviously not just an exaggeration, but a lie, and a very fat lie. The Hungarian foreign minister even indicated that the fact that that President Trump accompanied the Hungarian Prime Minister to the door was a special gesture that very few visitors to the White House will enjoy. Jokingly, I said in my Hungarian presentation that the other possible interpretation is that President Trump wanted to be sure that Mr. Orban will not linger in the White House and actually leaves the premises and leaves the White House. Essentially, nothing substantial came out of the meeting between President Trump and Mr. Orban, except that Mr. Orban considered the trip as an ego trip and as a tool to convince the Hungarians that he's the only one who can establish a good relationship with the American president, and he's the only one who can manage the relationships between the United States and Hungary, and the opposition is simply incapable or not good enough to do the same. When we look at the entire situation, Hungary is strategically totally unimportant. Mr. Orban spent less than 24 hours in Washington because, in spite of the Hungarian embassy's lobbying efforts, no congressman and no senator wanted to meet with him. In today's poisonous atmosphere, a unique bipartisan consensus emerged both on the Republican and Democrat sides that Mr. Orban is an autocrat. His illiberal democracy goes against the values of the West, of the United States and Western Europe, the European Union, and that Mr. Orban is the most corrupt or one of the most corrupt politicians, not just in Europe, but in the world. For this reason, no congressman, no representative from the House of Representatives, nor a senator from the Senate was willing to meet Mr. Orban in order not to soil his political reputation. Thirdly, the U.S. media, before the visit and after the visit, was unequivocally and uniformly negative about Mr. Orban, the conditions in Hungary, and the direction that Mr. Orban has taken the country in the last 9 years. Before his visit, on the weekend and even on Monday, editorials and articles appeared in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, in which everybody called him an autocrat, that his illiberal democracy is basically a dictatorship, and thirdly, that the corruption in Hungary goes beyond any imagination that people really envisaged with respect to a European country. As far as personally, I submitted in the name of my institute, the Frontiers of Freedom, a petition to both the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of State with respect to the Global Magnitsky Act, requesting that Mr. Orban and 8 other people, which include his father, his wife, his son-in-law, and some members of his cabinet, including the head of the Hungarian National Bank, György Matolcsy, to be excluded from the United States and their foreign assets be frozen by the United States. Not Mr. Orban, but 2 independent representatives from the Hungarian parliament were told in the State Department that my petition is still alive, and it depends how they will use it in the future, depends on how Mr. Orban will behave and follow those instructions that he received in the White House. Those were 3. First of all, that he should stop his private diplomacy with Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi, so he should not get too close to Russia or China. That's number one. Number two, that the press, the Hungarian press and the Hungarian media should be liberated, because right now Mr. Orban and his party controls almost 100% of the Hungarian media. The independence of the media, the freedom of the press must be restored. And thirdly, that the corruption must stop in Hungary. Those are very important issues, and if he does not change his policies vis-à-vis those three very important value-based democratic issues, then my petition, namely the Frontiers of Freedom's petition with respect to the Global Magnitsky Act, will most probably pursued, take effect, and carried out against him and all those individuals that are named in my petition. I must say that everything is fully documented. Mr. Orban is maybe the most corrupt politician that anybody can envisage, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. He does not comply with the values that we cherish here in the United States and the European cherish within the Union. That must stop. Also, he's too small to conduct an independent and private diplomacy vis-à-vis Russia and vis-à-vis China. Hungary is less than 10 million people. Maybe 20 or 30 cities in China are larger population-wise than the population, the total population of Hungary. So Mr. Orban will have to understand that he is not the center of the world, he's not the center of the diplomacy, he's not the bridge between the United States, Russia, and United States and China. He will have to fall in line and follow the foreign policies also of the United States and the European Union, and domestically he will have to adhere to the values of democracy. If he doesn't do it, he will have trouble, and he will have to wait 20 or some more years to be invited again to the White House and to Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching this episode, and hopefully that you did watch the previous episodes too of Conversations for Hungary. If you missed any or you would like to watch it again, please go to realnewstalk.com, and I hope to see you next week. All the best, and until next week, have a good and productive week ahead of you. Thank you.